Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our special webinar in June. We are going to be talking all about extreme heat and climate change, and we have a special guest with us tonight, Allison Homer, who is from the Office of Environmental and Energy Coordination, and she is the Resilient Fairfax Program Manager. So she's got a lot of great information to share with us tonight, so I am going to kick it off to her.
Great. Thank you so much, Courtney, and thank you all for joining us this evening. We can go ahead and get started. All right, so today's webinar is designed to cover all bases of extreme heat. So first, we'll explain what our offices do, the offices that Courtney and I work for. Then we'll walk through the difference between weather and climate, extreme heat trends in our county, and who and what is most vulnerable to extreme heat here locally. Then we'll talk about what the county is doing for extreme heat from three different angles: emergency preparedness, emissions reduction, and resilience. And then for each of those angles, we'll provide tips on what you can do personally for extreme heat. So to start us off, I'll hand it back over to Courtney to explain what the Department of Emergency Management and Security does.
So, as some of you guys might already know, we are the Department of Emergency Management and Security for the county, and we are the ones behind the scenes who are helping to coordinate when we have a large scale emergency where multiple agencies might need to respond. On a regular basis, we do all of our emergency plans for the county, we do training and exercising of those plans, and then we also keep the Emergency Operations Center operational and ready to go whenever we need it. We send out weather alerts, traffic alerts through our Fairfax alert system, and we do a lot of outreach to the public to let them know how to best prepare for emergencies and how to do some mitigation efforts and respond and recover from emergencies. So we do a wide variety of things. We have several different divisions, that split up all of these duties, but we are mostly behind the scenes doing that coordination role.
Perfect. Thanks, Courtney. And then the office that I work for is called the Office of Environmental and Energy Coordination. So, as our name implies, we provide county-wide coordination on environmental and energy topics. So, in addition to general environmental coordination, our office's duties can be roughly divided into four parts, shown on this slide. So, first, we work on environmental administration and policy. Second, we work on making our county government buildings and operations greener through things like solar panel installations and energy efficiency for county government buildings. Third, we have several community facing programs and innovation and sustainability. So that includes things like our HomeWise program, Green Business Partners, Charge Up Fairfax, and the upcoming Green Bank. And then fourth, with relevance to this webinar, we provide climate planning for both emissions reduction and resilience to changing hazards, such as extreme heat, flooding, and severe storms. And then finally, as is illustrated across the bottom of the slide in the green bar, all of our staff help with environmental and energy coordination and communications. So because the environment is relevant to just about every department because it relates relates to land development and transportation and public health and natural disasters, parks and natural resources, and much more, our office helps to connect those environmental dots between departments and ensure that we're well coordinated rather than siloed. And then we also coordinate with other municipalities and levels of government, community groups, utilities, nonprofits, and the general public. Before diving into details on extreme heat, we'd like to provide a few basic definitions. So climate is often confused with weather, but there's a key difference. Weather, of course, refers to the conditions that we experience day to day, and then climate, by definition, refers to the norms for our area based on conditions that have been averaged over 20 years or more. So those norms are how we're able to say that some places have a temperate climate versus a tropical climate, and so on. So on this slide, the map on the top right shows a weather event, while the map on the bottom right shows climate zones. And then if you're not a map person, another way of picturing this is in chart format. So if you imagine plotting every single weather event on a line chart that spans at least 20 years, a single dot is weather, whereas the full line is climate. So for most of Fairfax County history, our climate has been relatively stable and predictable. But in recent decades, our climate has seen a measurable shift. So when that climate trend line or the whole climate zone shifts, we start seeing more and more weather events that are outside of our historic norm. So, to summarize, an individual weather event is not climate, which is why an individual cold day does not negate climate change, nor does an individual hot day demonstrate it by itself. However, because our climate trend line or the climate zone is shifting, we're more and more likely to see weather that we would have previously called extreme. For a quick refresher on why that's happening, here's a fun little animated slide. So you have the Earth and the Earth's atmosphere. The sun sends solar radiation to the Earth as light. Some of that energy radiates back out into space as heat. And then on our planet, we naturally have some gases that are called greenhouse gases because they work like a greenhouse, trapping heat inside. The problem is that has been an exponential increase in the amount of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere due to increases in emissions from our cars, our power plants, our factories, our waste, agriculture, and more. And then with higher concentrations, too much heat is trapped in our atmosphere, which alters our very delicate global climate patterns of heat and moisture and exacerbates natural disaster related vulnerabilities. And then the reason that trees and natural resources are relevant to emissions is because they breathe in carbon dioxide, so they absorb some of our emissions. All right, so as that little animation just showed, climate change is a global phenomenon, but there are local effects. Here in Fairfax County, the trends we are experiencing can be summarized as warmer, wetter, weirder conditions. The warmer category is the main focus of this webinar. However, the county is also addressing and experiencing wetter conditions, including more intense rainfall, more flooding, and a rise in the Potomac River, and weirder conditions, including an increase in storm severity and more erratic weather patterns. If you've ever been confused by the definitions of heat advisories and heat outlooks and heat watches and heat warnings, you're not alone and don't feel bad. The reason it's hard to communicate these watches and warnings is because the definition of extreme heat depends not only on the raw temperature, but also on the humidity, how long the event will last, and the location of the event. Humidity plays a huge role because when it's humid, it's harder for us to physically keep our bodies cool. So the temperature feels much higher and we're physically at higher risk. So that's why the National Weather Service uses heat index rather than just temperature alone. So heat index includes both temperature and humidity. This chart from the National Weather Service shows how temperature and humidity combine to create that index. So, generally speaking, an excessive heat watch or warning is issued when the heat index is 105 or higher. So, for example, if you have a temperature of 90 degrees but a humidity of 70%, that creates a heat index of 105, and that would qualify as extreme heat. You can also get to a heat index of 105 by having a temperature of 98 degrees and a humidity of 40%. So, any combination of temperature and humidity that gets you to a heat index of 105 counts as extreme heat. In Fairfax County, extreme heat days are becoming more common over time as our climate shifts. These calendar graphics are a way to visualize that trend. The temperatures shown here are raw temperatures without humidity. So if you were to add humidity, they would be higher. Each calendar shows 105 days, or roughly 3 months, or the length of a summer. The first calendar shows our baseline climate, or the average number of extreme heat days per year between 1976 and 2005. The second calendar shows today's climate, or just before today's climate, so the average between 1990 and 2020. And the third calendar shows projected conditions for 2035 through 2064. And the fourth calendar shows projections for the end of century, or the number of extreme heat days per year on average between 2070 and 2099. The key takeaway here is that the number of extreme heat days per year has already increased a little bit in our county, and it's projected to increase further to the point where the majority of summer may technically qualify as extreme heat. I want to note here, though, that the future conditions shown here are based on models that assume business as usual, meaning that it assumes that worldwide will continue emitting pollution at our current rates. So the good news is that if we successfully reduce our emissions on a global scale, these projections might come down a little bit, although probably not down to the baseline. In addition to extreme heat days, there are other temperature-related trends happening here in Fairfax County. So first, we have something called the urban heat island effect, which is where certain urbanized parts of the county are significantly hotter on the ground than other areas of the county. So if you imagine yourself standing perhaps in a parking lot along Route 1 corridor or Route 50 corridor, surrounded by lots of roadways and asphalt and car exhaust and buildings with not much shade, that area is physically significantly hotter than, say, a neighborhood in the northern or southwestern parts of the county where there's lots of trees and green space. Our office collaborated with NASA Develop to map out the real measured land surface temperatures in 30-meter grid cells across the whole county. So those are based on measurements taken continuously from 2013 to 2020. It's important to note that these temperatures are land surface temperatures and not air temperatures. Um, the key takeaway of this map is that while extreme heat affects us all, it affects folks that are living in the urban heat islands even more. So the areas that are shown in red on that map on the left. So those areas may need more services and cooling centers and trees and other resources. Moving to the middle column, another trend is an increase in average annual temperatures. So that considers the whole year and not just extreme heat days. Our average annual temperature has increased by 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit per century since 1895, and it's projected to continue rising through this century. And then moving to the third column, we're also seeing milder winters or a decrease in extreme cold days. So it used to be that we would have about 86 days per year, or 3 months drop below freezing. And then as our winters warm, those numbers are on track to decrease to about 2 months per year by 2050, and then 1.5 months per year to 2 months by 2085. So fewer cold days. Everyone is vulnerable to extreme heat because we're all human, but there are certain populations that may be more exposed or more physically sensitive or less able to adapt to extreme heat, either due to personal or systemic factors. So these include people experiencing homelessness, outdoor workers, those with pre-existing health conditions or disabilities, those who cannot afford air conditioning, those without a vehicle or social networks or documentation. Children, the elderly, pregnant people also have higher sensitivity. And then people of color and those with limited English proficiency may have higher vulnerability, not due to personal factors, but due to systemic factors, such as redlining, that's resulted in those populations often living in areas of underinvestment or substandard housing and urban heat islands. To address these vulnerabilities and provide equitable services, it's important to know the locations of our vulnerable areas. This slide shows an example of how we identified which areas of the county are both exposed and sensitive to extreme heat. So for exposure, we used that NASA map of the actual land surface temperatures, summarized them by census tract. And then for sensitivity, we used census population data to find neighborhoods where large numbers of residents have high heat sensitivity. So then when you combine those two maps, you get the map on the right, the one with the blue and the purple. So while we, of course, serve everyone in the county, the census tracts that show up in purple or the tracts that are in darker shades for our colorblind blind friends, those are the areas that may need the most help with extreme heat. And then in addition to this census data, we also have data on populations experiencing homelessness who might not show up in census data. So we know that people and assets are vulnerable to extreme heat, but what exactly are those vulnerabilities? What exactly are the impacts? We have a 300-page vulnerability and risk assessment that was done as part of Resilient Fairfax that goes into great detail for anyone who's curious, but the key takeaways are summarized here. So, for populations, extreme heat causes not only heat related illnesses like heat stroke and heat exhaustion, but it can also exacerbate existing cardiovascular and respiratory issues. It can also make air pollution hang around longer and a longer pollen season, triggering respiratory distress. And it can affect our drinking water quality because our stormwater runoff is hotter and there are more algae blooms and waterborne toxins. Extreme heat can also put a strain on our public services. For example, our emergency responders, who are themselves directly exposed to extreme heat and who also have reduced capacity during extreme heat events. So, the more folks we have responding to heat strokes, the fewer responders we have available to respond to other emergencies like car crashes and heart attacks. And then extreme heat also affects our natural resources and crops, especially for species that are less able to adapt to extreme heat. It puts a strain on our electricity grid. When more people are cranking their air conditioning, demand jumps up, and then the grid infrastructure itself can be sensitive to extreme heat. Finally, extreme heat also causes physical impacts to our transportation infrastructure, like our roadways and our railroad tracks. That picture of the track there on the slide is a WMATA track, a metro track that buckled in the heat. Basically, the metal expands too quickly. So all of that means more frequent repairs and slower service. If you're a person who loves maps, there's a Resilient Fairfax interactive map viewer that's publicly accessible. You can explore many different heat and asset layers in addition to other climate layers such as inland and riverine and storm surge flooding. As a tip, you can turn off the different layers by clicking the eyeball icons next to the layer names. That's not always intuitive to everybody. So check that out if you're interested. All right, so the good news in all of this is that the county is addressing extreme heat from multiple angles. So, first, we have emergency plans and preparedness for when extreme heat strikes. Courtney will tell you all about that in a moment. Second, Fairfax County is doing our part in that global group project to reduce emissions that are contributing to the problem. And third, we're boosting our resilience to extreme heat, which means helping our populations, our infrastructure, natural resources, and public services adapt to or become better at withstanding extreme heat conditions. So, for each of these categories, we'll briefly talk about what the county is doing and then also what you can do as an individual. So, I'll hand it over to Courtney to talk about the emergency category.
Awesome. Thank you. So, as of this week, we do have a new website that you can find on the county site. It is a topic page about extreme heat resources. And on this page, you can find information about what cooling centers are available during the summer, particularly on those days where we have heat advisories or the heat index reaches over either 105 or over 105. We also have some more information up on the website about how to sign up for Fairfax alerts, as well as making sure you're signed up for those extreme heat warnings. And those come out straight from the National Weather Service. So it's really important that you can get those alerts and know what actions to take beforehand. The next thing that we're going to show you is a new interactive map that you can use. The link is on the extreme heat page, but this is a map where you can go and type in your address and look to see what cooling centers would be around you. And it even will give you directions on how to get to either the closest one or whatever one you're going to pick. And next up, we're going to talk a little bit about what you can do before. So in our community emergency response guide, we have a whole page on extreme heat, and it gives information on what to do before, during, or after. But of course, you want to make sure you're signed up for Fairfax alerts and you're getting those messages. You want to make sure that you're drinking plenty of fluids and staying hydrated, and that means making sure you have enough electrolytes, dressing appropriately. If it's going to be really hot outside, make sure that you are either taking frequent breaks or even just staying indoors. Going to a mall or going to the movies are great options. If you are going to be exercising outside, waiting until it's a little bit cooler at night to be able to do that. But also know that when enough is enough. So if you are not feeling well, take action, get to a place where it's cooler, drink fluids, try to cool off. And then if you do need help, make sure you call 911 so that, help can get to you in time. So knowing what to do beforehand could really help you, prepare for the summer months. Allison, I think it's back over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Courtney. So next we will talk about in the blue middle column emissions reduction, or doing our part in the global group effort to reduce greenhouse gas pollutants. It's important to reduce these pollutants so that we reduce our contributions to the warming climate, and we also reduce local exhaust heat and improve our local air quality. We have emissions reduction plans both for the county government and for the population as a whole. The plan shown here is for the whole population. It's called CCAP, which stands for Community-Wide Energy and Climate Action Plan. So CCAP was written literally by and for the community. So the strategies are organized into 5 major sectors. The graph on the right shows how much each strategy will help us reduce our emissions. CCAP has an overarching goal of carbon neutrality by 2050, and then there are interim goals along the way. The first 3 categories, buildings and energy efficiency, energy supply, and transportation, have the most potential for emissions reduction. So when our buildings are more energy efficient, they of course use less energy. So that means we reduce the fossil fuels being burned at power plants to produce that electricity. Similarly, when we have renewable energy like solar panels, we rely less on burning fossil fuels. And then in the transportation category, when we walk and bike and take more transit, we reduce pollution coming from our cars. Electric vehicles, for those who can afford that option, also help reduce car pollution. Reducing our waste is also critical along the full waste supply chain. And then finally, natural resources are relevant to emissions, like I mentioned before, because plants breathe in carbon dioxide, so they help to absorb some of our emissions. If you're wondering what you can do as far as emissions reduction, here are a few quick tips. First, I want to let everyone know that you can check out a thermal camera from the library just like a book. The thermal camera plugs into the bottom of your smartphone, and then you can walk around your house looking through the screen of your phone and find drafty spots where you're losing air conditioning. And then you can pick up free weatherization kits, either from the library or from one of our HomeWise events, to plug those holes or to weatherize your house, saving you money on your electricity bill while also saving energy. If you're in the market for new appliances, you might consider electric rather than gas appliances, both for emissions reduction and to improve your own indoor air quality. And then for transportation, there are many incentives that are available to take transit or carpool or consider an EV, again, if that's realistic for your budget. And then walking and biking always reduces your emissions as well and is good for your health. And then for energy supply, there are also incentives and tax credits that are available for solar panels. For natural resources, there are many native tree planting and invasive species removal groups that you can join. And for waste, we encourage folks to reduce as much waste as possible, avoid using single-use items, and reduce, reuse, recycle, and compost. So for more resources and information on these and other topics, you can see the Climate Action Dashboard. Okay, so the third and final category we'll talk about today is resilience, which is detailed in the Resilient Fairfax plan. You already know a little bit about Resilient Fairfax because the maps and the climate data from the beginning of this webinar are Resilient Fairfax materials. Resilient Fairfax is led by our office, the Office of Environmental and Energy Coordination, but it's truly a collaborative effort involving over 30 county agencies. DEMS is a key partner. Resilience is related to, but a little bit different from emergency planning. So as Courtney discussed earlier, the emergency management folks help us handle emergencies when they strike, like helping people suffering from heat stroke on hot days or preventing that heat stroke from happening. Resilience, on the other hand, helps us adapt to or be less affected by those hazards through things like ensuring everyone can afford their air conditioning bills, planting more shade trees, using infrastructure materials that stay cooler in the heat. So I'll talk through a few of those examples. There are 48 strategies in the Resilient Fairfax plan, which is currently being implemented. Those 48 strategies are organized into the 4 pillars that are shown here. So the integrated action planning pillar has strategies that provide the foundation for long-term success through resilience-related interagency coordination, like what we're doing today, data, funding, and plan alignment. The Climate Ready Communities pillar includes promotion of county services and aid, public education and outreach, and updates to our county codes to encourage more climate ready development. The Resilient Infrastructure and Buildings pillar in orange includes both upgrades to our internal infrastructure that's within county control, like our stormwater pipes, and then partnership for external infrastructure upgrades like electricity grid reliability improvements or metro track upgrades. And then the adaptive environments pillar in green includes both protection and restoration of environmental resources, which naturally provide climate resilience. So, for example, when our trees and our forests are healthy, they naturally reduce extreme heat. The team of 30 county agencies implementing the strategies in Resilient Fairfax, that's currently going on right now with a focus on these 18 priority strategies. This interagency collaboration is enabling us to make good progress already, less than a year into implementation. So these strategy bars show the status of those strategies, and I'll provide a few examples of these strategies in the next couple of slides. So first, one of the most important things we can do is to boost access to aid and services for our community so that they're less vulnerable to extreme heat in the first place. There are many relevant county and nonprofit services, but we discovered through our community engagement that people may not realize that those services exist, or there are barriers to access, or the services need to be expanded. As Courtney described earlier, we're boosting access to cooling centers and heat alerts. And then, in addition, we're spreading the word that the Department of Family Services provides financial assistance to those who cannot afford their air conditioning. There are also home and appliance repair programs, aid for those experiencing homelessness, and basic needs services that help people stay on their feet and in adequate housing. We're also looking into updating safety standards for outdoor workers during extreme heat events, ensuring they have access to sufficient water breaks and cooling vests or cooler uniforms. Um, this slide focuses on heat related services for the purposes of this webinar, but it should be noted that we are also expanding access to services for other climate hazards like flooding and severe storms. We are also working on establishing the county's first resilience hubs, which are sites that help a community build resilience before, during, and after climate shocks and stressors like severe storms or heat waves. Resilience hubs are usually existing trusted neighborhood facilities like rec centers, community centers, and libraries that are upgraded to be more physically resilient to extreme weather. For example, sometimes they have solar plus battery backup to continue running during power outages. Sometimes they have flood proofing so that they don't flood, or cool roofs, cool pavements, and green infrastructure so that the buildings themselves are more resilient to extreme heat. We're also planning on providing a range of community services through the hubs and community trainings that help residents boost their resilience. So, for example, the Department of Emergency Management and Security might give trainings on how to prepare emergency kits, and the health department might talk about how to recognize the signs of heat stroke. Our office can talk about how to weatherize your home and make your surroundings more resilient. Department of Public Works and Environmental Services can talk about how to flood proof your home, and so on. And then additionally, we're planning to have staff at the hubs know the basics of county services that exist so that they can refer residents to the right application processes. Resilience hubs are a little bit different from cooling centers and shelters because resilience hubs operate day to day in existing facilities rather than being triggered only during emergencies. However, there may ultimately be sites that serve multiple purposes. We've applied for a $1 million EPA grant in hopes of establishing pilot resilience hubs, and we'll find out whether we were awarded that grant this fall. Another way to boost resilience to extreme heat is by making our homes, buildings, and neighborhoods more physically heat resilient. So, cool roofs and cool pavements reflect sunlight rather than absorbing it, so they stay much cooler. For example, a black roof absorbs most of the sunlight that hits it, reflecting only 5%, whereas a white roof reflects 75% of that sunlight. That makes a huge difference in temperature. Black roofs are 55 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than white roofs. There are also building materials and insulation types that help homes stay cooler, and there are design choices that developers can make to angle buildings based on the path of the sun. Landscaping with big native shade trees is also a huge help. So, we are working on policy updates and guidance to encourage these practices to help reduce urban heat islands and keep our neighborhoods cooler. Speaking of shade trees, targeted tree plantings and urban forestry are also critical to heat resilience. This is obvious, right? Even as kids, we all instinctively know that shaded areas are 15 to 20 degrees cooler than unshaded areas. We have a plethora of existing tree planting programs in Fairfax County that do great work, but there are some existing gaps. So, for example, many of these programs apply only to public or school land. It's a little bit more difficult to find tree planting programs for private property. Our urban forestry management division and various county partners are working on streamlining and expanding these efforts through a new Fairfax County tree canopy program. And we're also actively applying for federal funding to support tree planting and forest health. In addition to trees, there are other nature-based solutions that can help. Green infrastructure, that's just a fancy name for designs that combine man-made infrastructure with nature. We found that using only gray infrastructure like concrete and steel is probably a bad idea, and that nature often does a much better job. So when we make our infrastructure greener and we connect it properly to natural systems, we have reduced urban heat islands and better stormwater management, more habitat connectivity and pollination, and better aesthetics. It looks better. The county has installed many of our own green infrastructure projects at county buildings, and we also encourage developers to use green infrastructure in their designs. I would like to shout out our partners at Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District who provide green infrastructure assistance and workshops and guidance for community members for your own properties. So I encourage everyone to check out their website for more information. If you're wondering where exactly to find all of this information, you're in luck because we've created a one stop shop for climate related information called the Climate Action Dashboard. We had a lot of residents tell us that there are just too many county departments and it's hard to know which website to go to. The dashboard links you to resources from a range of departments and partners, and we're continually adding more. In addition to the dashboard, we're also collaborating more broadly with our partner agencies for community education, outreach, guidance, and events like this, so that our residents are able to receive the information they need, regardless of which specific departments they usually keep in touch with. We're also working on a climate checklist for residents, which will include not only action items that you can check off, but also resources and incentives to help you check those items off the list. Fairfax County is also proud to be cutting edge and science based, so we're working on various research projects and partnerships. For example, our office is partnering with the Health Department and George Mason for research on topics like vector borne diseases to see whether mosquito populations, for example, are changing with climate. We're also studying rainfall and stormwater design standards, urban forestry data, and many other mapping exercises to ensure that we're serving the neighborhoods most in need. So, in addition to the heat emergency tips that Courtney shared earlier and the emissions reduction tips that I walked through earlier, you can also take actions to boost your resilience to extreme heat. So we always encourage native tree plantings. You can also switch to cool roofs and cool pavements if you're a property owner. Sometimes this literally just means painting them white with the proper paint, of course. If you're associated with a business that has outdoor workers, consider updating your protocols and your breaks and uniforms for summer months. If you have a kid in sports, we recommend updating those protocols as well. More water breaks. Um, Connect your neighbors and friends to county resources if they're in need, if they can't afford air conditioning or they need other services. And check on your neighbors, especially elderly and disabled neighbors during extreme heat. And then finally, please spread the word of the heat emergency tips and resources that Courtney shared earlier from the Department of Emergency Management and Security. We have, I think, pasted the links to this PDF in the chat, and the PDF includes all of the links to all of the various resources that we discussed today. And then if you need help or have additional questions, we're happy to answer those now. You can also send an email to Resilient Fairfax at fairfaxcounty.gov, and we can connect you with the right department or right staff member. And with that, I will open it up to see whether we have any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Allison. I don't see any questions in the chat, but this is a lot of great information. And I just want to remind everyone, you can always go back and watch this again. It will be on the YouTube channel, but you can also go to fairfaxcounty.gov/emergency/ready-fairfax. And we do have a monthly webinars tab on the left-hand side. And the presentation is posted there, And then, of course, the link is here too. We do actually have one question, and it is, what is the temperature that determines a day we will be experiencing this year?
Good question. So it's a heat index of 105, but there are a range of temperatures and humidity levels that can bring us to that heat index. So, because the heat index is based on both temperature and humidity, the temperature can be as low as 86 degrees. If the humidity is very high, that might bump up the feels like temperature to 105. Or it could be a raw temperature of 105 with no humidity. So it's a heat index of 105, which is a combination of temperature and humidity.
Awesome. Thank you so much for answering that. Um, We thank you so much again for watching the webinar tonight. Our next webinar is going to be on Wednesday, July 5th, and we are going to be talking about the ways that you can respond to an emergency. So we'll talk a little bit about our run, hide, fight, and our different scenarios of when we might need to evacuate or shelter in place and what actions you can take. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you in July.